Let's play a game. Can you name 3 classical music composers? Go on, I'll give you 5 seconds. So who was it? I bet you thought of Mozart, Beethoven, maybe even Chopin, all great musicians and composers. But they and most well-known classical musicians have something else in common. They're all men. Let's put it to test. Can you name 3 female classical music composers? Gets a lot harder, right? Well, if you're wondering why, you came to the right place. Well, hi Armen, thank you so much for joining me. Maybe you can give a little bit of a background on who you are and what you do.
Of course. Carolina, thank you for having me. My name is Armen Nalbandian. I'm a pianist and composer. My background is very rich in both classical music and in the early part of my career with jazz. I've studied both very deeply, but my most recent work involves spontaneous composition. I have released 23 albums under my name. And I would say the most recent ones are focused within that specific mechanism. So the theories that come from that world specifically, and developing that as well. In addition to that, I'm a co-founder of an organization called Outlier, which looks at other ways of championing the arts.
So that's exactly why we reached out to you, because we wanted to talk about how, you know, when you think about classical composers, it's always the likes of Beethoven, Mozart, and Chopin that are in the spotlight. Like even when you do a quick search on Google search, you see a long list of male composers that goes on and on, while female composers seem to be more like a footnote. And so, yeah, we wanted to know, what's the backstory behind this gender gap in the classical music composition?
I think it's a very important history to uncover, and I'm so thankful that you asked me to participate in highlighting this. I can say, first of all, that it's important to note that with musicians in the classical canon, we look at these artists, composers specifically, as these standalone geniuses that compose almost in a bubble. Like with this idea of Beethoven, I think is probably the most elevated of someone who sits at, at his the piano or a desk and, furiously composes. And we have this romantic idea of what a composer is. And none of my comments is to take anything away from these great composers, because they are all clearly great. But I think they work. The understanding that I have is about the entire ecosystem that these composers come out of and what their community was. Now, at the time of these composers' greatest work, what is really important to know, and so this time period that we consider to be the classical time period, that perhaps starts with Bach and works its way forward. The idea of who was deemed appropriate to be a composer was strictly male. Which is clearly absurd, but that was what was reinforced through society, is that the performers would be female, and then the male musicians would be, deemed as the composers in this very, I'm simplifying, but in the simplistic way of understanding music and those who contribute to it. But what's very important to know is that even as the women were deemed performers, they were also limited to specific instruments that were, considered to be feminine enough to be performed on. So those most notably are the piano, the harp, and the violin. And so even though women were participating in this, rich tradition, it was still very much limited to these very specific roles. I mean, even the broader conversation perhaps is also about class, and how in high society, to be considered a well-rounded woman and like be primed for marriage and all these things that we know of that era, that you would need to learn how to play an instrument. Like it was almost part of your like requirement that you're to fulfill, or like a well-rounded education. Whereas the idea of the men being composers is being reinforced during that, because I mean, frankly, they're given the opportunities to compose.
Yeah, but I do know that, however, there's like a few figures in the history of classical music, female figures that have made important contributions to the genre. So I was wondering if you could tell us which figures are the most influential and what were their contributions.
Of course. I mean, this is what gets me most excited because I feel anytime you get to speak about important figures in the arts and in music specifically, you're doing a very important duty to highlight not just the great, what we consider to be the great composers, Bach, Beethoven, etc., but going back to my comment about the ecosystem, you have very specific artists, and I would say this is important to note specifically in the case of someone like Clara Schumann, who was considered to be one of the greatest pianists in the world, like period, like virtuoso, and from the time that she was very young. And the thing about Clara that is important to note is that she was admired so fully by all of the great composers of that time period. I mean, the tragic thing here is that when we look at, and I should say this almost as a caveat, when we look at um, composers, women composers, a lot of times they get highlighted as a result of their relationship to the male composers, their counterparts, sometimes their husbands or siblings or whatnot. And in the case of Clara, I think that's what happened, which I think takes away from her own contributions, is that she's, obviously associated with her husband, Robert Schumann, who is a tremendous composer in his own right, and also that of Brahms, also one of the most important composers that has ever lived. But Clara played a very different role that I think supersedes definitely her reputation, even though she's been championed recently. What is important to note about Clara is, at this point, she's getting a lot of recognition for being a very, very important pianist. And she marries and meets Robert very young, and they're considered to be a very important couple. Two very important musical minds that happen to be married together, and the influence is very deep. But when you look at the things that Robert Schumann said about his own work, is he would talk about how important Clara's influence was on that. And I think that's different sometimes in the way women are portrayed in classical music. They're sometimes unfortunately relegated to the idea of the muse, most famously like Alma Mahler influencing that beautiful part of Mahler's Fifth Symphony. That, while beautiful and incredible, and the romance behind that is lovely, there's a very direct relationship between a partner, not so much a muse, and that's what Clara was for Robert Schumann. Now, it becomes even more interesting when you hear about the things that both Clara and Robert Schumann said about Clara's role in society and what she was looking to overcome. Because it should be noted that Clara, while being a great pianist, was also Robert's wife, and had certain what they would consider certain duties as a result, but also the mother of 8 children. And so you think about the impact that makes, because you are essentially running a household. You're leading this home, and so there's 2 interesting quotes that I wanted to share with you that I think are very, very telling about this time period. And one is from Clara Schumann, and these are very widely reported quotes that can be found pretty readily. But she says, "I once believed that I possessed creative talent, but I have given up this idea. A woman must not desire to compose. There has never yet been one able to do it. Should I expect it to be the one?" Okay.
Wow.
Right? That's tremendous. Like that she, as she had this understanding of what the limitations were. And then Robert, who, thankfully was aware of his wife's genius, he says, "Clara has composed a series of small pieces which show a musical and tender ingenuity such as she has never attained before. But to have children and a husband who is always living in the realm of imagination does not go together with composing. She cannot work at it regularly, and I am often disturbed to think of how many profound ideas are lost because she cannot work them out.
Wow.
Right? So you have these, they're very aware of what's occurring.
And it's coming from them. That's
It's
really
coming directly
interesting.
from them and their writings. And so what happens is, as a result of her deciding to decrease her attention on her composition, which she did very, very early in her career, she's like, I'm just focusing on being a pianist. It was not only that she was a great pianist. So Chopin, he would write to Franz Liszt and say what a great pianist she was. I mean, there's countless reports of what a great artist she was and interpreter, and how these incredible composers wanted her to perform their music, including Chopin, and obviously her husband, and even Liszt. But the important thing is how she changed what the piano recital was. See, I think now we have this understanding of how classical music tradition is put together. We look at the institutions, the philharmonics around the world, and what music is performed regularly over and over and over again. And now it's a given that Beethoven is on every single program, in every single, philharmonic
Yeah.
and symphony orchestra, and Bach is as well. And the music is incredible, and it should be. But what were the mechanisms that reinforced this addition to this canon? And so when you look at Clara Schumann, she was the first to look at works that were slightly older than the current music that was being composed. So she was including Bach and Beethoven, along with other pianists, of course, but was very much championing them as a regular part of the canon and the piano recital. But at the same time, she was looking at contemporaries, and she would include Schumann and she would include Chopin. And so over the period of her career, which is, she lived very, very old, and 50, 60 years that she was performing, which is a tremendous long time.
Wow. Yeah. And
You know,
with 8 children.
right, exactly. And she was also, I should say, she was the breadwinner of the household. She was the one that, through her piano performances, was the financial stability of their household. And then, there's a very sad story. I digress, but there's a very sad story about Robert Schumann having a mental breakdown and attempting to end his life, and being, put into a mental asylum, in his mid 40s. And
Wow.
through this entire thing, you have Clara Schumann that is taking care of her children and doing all of, and being a great artist in her own right.
Mm.
What's important is that you look at her programs, which have been, thankfully, we have records of all of this. It's not that the records don't exist, and this is very important to note. It's not that the records don't exist and that the women didn't make great contributions, because clearly they
Yeah.
did. It's just as being underreported and undershared and minimized, and that's what they've done to Clara Schumann, among several others. But she's a very important case, because when we look again, we go back to the piano recital and we think about Chopin. She included his work. I mean, she did 1,300 recitals in her life. She would always include his work as part of the recital. And when she retired from performing briefly, and then when she returned, she included his work twice as often. And so when you think of, you have perhaps the most famous, or one of the most famous pianists in the entire world, that is beloved by all of the great composers. And she's performing regularly all around Europe, and people are going to hear her. And what music is she performing over and over and over and over again? Is the music of Chopin. And so we know that now we appreciate his music, but where did that reinforcement of the canon come from?
Right.
And that's very important to realize, is that she's an influence on her husband, yes, of course, but she's an influence on the broader music world, to where you have these great composers that love the fact that she performs their music, and want her to perform their music. In fact, when Chopin would visit where Robert and Clara lived, he would come specifically to visit with them and show the works that weren't published yet, and talk to them about his work. And it was that type of a relationship. And so when I speak about the broader ecosystem, that they all worked in. They all needed each other. It was this ability of composers to be together and to discuss ideas and to flesh things out and to hear music performed, and the interpretation. The way that Clara would interpret would be different than how, for instance, Chopin would interpret his work. And that is a very important thing to understand in terms of music also, is that because we have elevated the idea of the composer as the prominent figure in classical music, we forget that this music has to also be performed. And how it's performed is as a result of how it's received. How often it's performed results in how it's held within the overall classical music canon. And there's examples in 21st century music, and probably before as well, of great classical composers that didn't have their music performed very well, and so they weren't successful as a result. And Clara Schumann is a shining light of that focus on integrity, and to also champion that of the work of the composer more so, even though she was the performer that was putting them on and really championing Chopin, etc. It's the fact that she focused on the composer's work more so than the performer, even though clearly the performer is such an important part of this equation.
Yeah, that's coming a little bit from an electronic music background. It makes me think like she was the ultimate DJ.
We have to I think understand where people hear music and how they
Yeah.
heard music before, and how they're exposed to music. And if high society is going to hear Clara Schumann, this is the music she's choosing to play and reinforce and champion and say, look how important and beautiful and incredible this music is. That's where people are going to consistently be fed on the music and be exposed to the music.
And it is also from my understanding that like there were more girls learning piano than there were boys learning piano. So I was also wondering what the education side of it looked like, and were the educators also female? Was that one of the things that they could do as pianists or composers?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And you bring up a really great segue to the other incredible artist that I want to discuss. And I think she does a great job of explaining the role of education, and specifically her role in education is Nadia Boulanger. And I mean, we're talking about perhaps the greatest teacher in music history, and very much lost in the idea of what we were discussing before when we were discussing Clara Schumann, this idea of the great composer that works individually. Now, to be a composer, we have to also understand, and when we speak about something like a piano concerto, a symphony, or any of these works, these are very, very detailed, oftentimes long, very difficult, incredible work that it takes to produce one of these pieces of music is tremendous. And in order to be able to do this, it doesn't come from this idea of genius, even though, of course, we're speaking about geniuses without a doubt, but it doesn't come from this what's it called? Like, I have been given this gift that now I can sit down and do this. You know, the idea of perhaps Mozart is a fantastic, or even, you know, Beethoven. It's that they're learning from somebody, that there is a sense of education. This music is very, very difficult. And in the terms of composition and understanding the fundamentals of music and how you go about composition, Nadia Boulanger is the best example of someone who has taught a tremendous number of great composers. And when you have somebody like Aaron Copland, who is one of our great composers of the 20th century, saying something like, she knew everything there was to know about music. You have George Gershwin, who went to study with her in Paris, who she refused. Who you have modern You know, someone like Quincy Jones, who studied with Nadia Boulanger, and Astor Piazzolla, who studied with Nadia Boulanger. Leonard Bernstein would send her scores, most famously of West Side Story, before it was premiered, to get her feedback on it. She would take any student, and the difficulty of what she made her students do, and she was so prized as an educator. But she was far more than an educator, because she was clearly a great instrumentalist, but she was also a great conductor, and she conducted and premiered many, many works. And what I like to focus on Nadia Boulanger, which is, I think, how we look at how a great artist, and I mean great artist without tying it to gender, just great artist. Nadia Boulanger, great educator, Nadia Boulanger, how she's lost. And the greatest example of this is when Stravinsky's son was going to begin learning music at a certain level. Stravinsky looked for the right teacher for his son. So we're talking about one of the greatest composers ever. And Stravinsky chooses Nadia Boulanger to be his son's teacher and sends him off to go and study with her. The relationship, so that's the respect, of course, that she had by composers like Stravinsky, who she developed the most remarkable relationship with in learning his work before it was premiered and editing his work and offering suggestions on his work over decades. And there's the correspondence of the two of theirs has been published, and it's well documented. And it's actually so fascinating for anybody that is interested in a tremendously fascinating correspondence between two brilliant, brilliant musical minds. The correspondence between Stravinsky and Nadia Boulanger is tremendous. And what you see is Nadia constantly either requesting pieces, or she's obtained a piece or has been given a piece by Stravinsky, and she's reviewing the score, and she's connecting the score with her memory of the piece being performed, or something Stravinsky said to her, or something she may feel as an inaccuracy. And she would write these detailed questions in editing it. Did you mean this? I think this is an inaccuracy. I will not change any of your notes, she writes, but I will change, dynamics, or, perhaps accents or something like that to maybe add consistency to the piece, but needed his approval to change things that Stravinsky was very happy to have Nadia Boulanger make these edits onto his work. And what you see is another example of, we know the great Chopin, we know the great Stravinsky, right? But what is the community, the ecosystem, the people that are in their lives that made their music possible? It is a tremendously difficult thing to edit a symphony or a piece of classical music, to look at a score and to make sure that it is the composer's intention, because there's a high room for error. And we're speaking about a time where everything is handwritten and scores are duplicated by hand. And so you're giving scores, and so you look at it, and I think somewhere around 44 works of Stravinsky's were edited by Nadia Boulanger.
Wow.
It wasn't a one-off. It was a long-term relationship, which I understand lasted up until Stravinsky started writing serial music, and his forays in serialism. And what's really, really important about this, so now we've understood that she's had an impact on his work, that she's edited his work, that she's refined, in my opinion, his work. And there are comparisons you can even find if you study this, where they can see what Stravinsky wrote, what Nadia Boulanger said it should be, or what the edit should be, and what the finished product was. And it's clearly what's suggested. This is, some of the greatest masterpieces that we've heard throughout our lives. But she's one of the most important educators. And so what happens as an educator is that Nadia Boulanger is also teaching the work of Stravinsky. And Stravinsky's work comes out as being very controversial at the beginning of his career, before he's accepted to be the genius that he was. And so you have someone who's such an important educator and such an important teacher, who's teaching a wide variety of students, teaching the work of Stravinsky. And so then you see Stravinsky's music become more properly a part of the canon as well. And so we talk about, where does the canon come from? Who creates the canon, et cetera? It comes from the educators. And when you look at the composers that studied with Nadia Boulanger, and I mentioned some of them, but even like Philip Glass studied with her, who writes extensively about his time with her and how brilliant she was as an educator. It's important to understand that her influence on Stravinsky, for example, was also reversed, in that she would influence her students with the music of Stravinsky. And so that reinforces the importance of this music over a period of time. And so I use these as examples in the case of Clara Schumann and Nadia Boulanger, because it's important to know that the idea of music is, it requires so many people to make it what it is, especially the classical music. Like, we already know that the composer's crucial, and the conductor, if it's an ensemble that has a conductor, is extremely important, as are all the instrumentalists. But we have to understand the worlds that these composers come up in, the fact that they show each other their works, they get feedback on what they're working on. And there's so many examples of this in history. And I think it's a disservice when we look at composers being these individual mechanisms that just create in a vacuum, because they don't. And unfortunately, what happens is, when you read large articles on Chopin, Clara Schumann is not mentioned at all. Nadia Boulanger is not mentioned, unless it's a very large scale thing on Stravinsky. She's not mentioned as being as important, and she's reduced. Like, the Washington Post in, I believe it was 1982, wrote an article referring to her as the midwife of the music. And perhaps we understand what they're getting at, but that's such a reduction of what she contributed. And it plays this thing we talk about, how gender is reinforced in these situations. This is how the music is written about, even though we look at what she has accomplished and how she has contributed. None of this is secret. It's well publicized work of both of these incredible people. But these are but two examples. And I think that's what's important, is when you realize that you have people like Nadia Boulanger or Clara Schumann who are so pivotal to the music, you start to ask the question of, well, it can't just be the two of them. It's a bigger world, because we are all the sum of our communities that we live in. And by saying it was only these European men that created classical music, and that's why we celebrate them over and over again, while they are brilliant without question, they are not alone by any measure.
That's that's very, very interesting indeed. And I see like that dynamic as well. So you had all of these men who were influential, who revered and looked up to people like Nadia and Clara, and yet somehow they are still it just makes you think, like, how I can see it today as well, in all different kinds, not even in music, just in general, how, like, it is interesting to see how we can have so many men support us, and see in their own experience that women are just as capable, and sometimes in some things even more capable than themselves. And somehow that doesn't translate to the wider society and the way that we see women.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very complicated question, because what it is, these things get reinforced over time. And if we were to talk about, like, Nadia Boulanger is the 20th century, and Clara Schumann is the 18th century. But if we look at today, and we see that 1% of all the compositions that are performed by the 22 largest ensembles are, composed by women, that's being reinforced today. And when we find that the first time a woman was in a major orchestra was in 1912, if I'm not mistaken, that this is being reinforced time and time again. And the fact that in 1982, they're writing this way about Nadia Boulanger, or I think it's the way that we've continually reinforced this, because it's not this simple history that is portrayed as. The history of classical music is also the history of, like, it's history. It's the
Yeah.
history of the world. And when we speak about only some people, we eliminate all others.
Mm.
Case of the incredible contributions that women made to classical music. I've never understood, it's why I was so excited to speak to you about this. I've never understood why women have had to fight for their place in the classical music tradition when they're, or otherwise. But we're speaking specifically about the classical music tradition when
Yeah.
it's so obvious. You know what I mean? It's so obvious of their greatness, and it's so obvious
Yeah.
of what they've contributed to. It's not something that can be debated. It's, you can
Yeah.
listen to. I mean, the other thing is Nadia Boulanger, I must add, is I've spoken to them about educators and instrumentalists and conductors. They were also great composers. Clara Schumann was a great composer who, in her teens, wrote a piano trio that influenced Robert Schumann's piece that he wrote a decade later. Or that Nadia Boulanger wrote beautiful, beautiful pieces of music that are just stunning. They're shimmering. And it's about how and when does this music get performed? And it
Yeah.
cannot be performed, in my estimation. It's great that we have these programs that highlight, look at the wonderful contributions of women throughout all the arts.
Hmm.
It can't be the only way that they are appreciated. It has to be part of the regular programming that exists at the symphony level, at the institution level. It
Yeah.
can't be the token that we do when it's convenient to do it. It has to always be part of the curriculum. It has to be taught. And I think what Nadia Boulanger did as an educator is tremendous. I believe there should be a statue of her in every city,
Mm.
and what she was able to do for someone like Stravinsky is to shine the light and say how important he was to music. And I wish I didn't feel like I had to do the same thing in return, to say, look at how incredible
Mm.
Boulanger was. I wish there was common knowledge. And I certainly hope that with the growing attention in these great composers, that there'll be more that is uncovered. And to finish answering your question, I think what needs to be done is, while we honor the great work that was done by somebody like Nadia Boulanger or Clara Schumann, it's important to recognize that there are a tremendous number of incredible
Yeah.
women composers that are currently composing, actively producing remarkable works. And I think that what happens is, sometimes we look to the past to correct something, as opposed to realizing that we can act in the present and make sure that we are championing greatness that exists currently.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a lovely way to end it.
Uh,
But yeah, it also made me think how, like, yeah, it's a problem that, like, going back to how it keeps being reinforced. It also comes from the point of representation, right? That's something that I've been talking with the composers that are in our compilation coming out on Women's Day. I was wondering what their experience as women in the industry and as pianists was, and quite a few of them came back with the point of representation, how, like, growing up and when it came to the moment of choosing what career they would go for, they didn't, like, they're classically trained as well, and pianists who have studied all the classics, and I can totally see there how, like, if they didn't learn that there were all of these women, if that was not part of their curriculum, it got to the point where, like, when they had to make the decision, okay, will I, like, it maybe it's not even a question for them, like, I don't think I can do this as a career because I haven't seen it. And many of them came back and said, like, I wonder if I would have seen more women in the curriculum and more women having successful careers as pianists and composers, maybe I would have seen that as a viable career. And that's indeed also reinforcing it, right? Because if there are no women highlighted, then maybe women won't follow that path because they don't think it's for them.
Absolutely. I mean, you say so well what Clara said in that quote of her
Yeah.
writing that I read to you. To reiterate, she says, "But I've given up this idea a woman must not desire to compose. There has never yet been one able to do it." And could you think if Clara Schumann had seen represented in her world other women composers where she felt that she could do it, where she felt
Yeah.
that she did have the allowance to do so, that if there was a society,
What would we have
what
seen?
would we have seen from the likes of Clara Schumann and all of the countless other incredible both women composers and potential women composers? I think that's one
Yes,
of the
indeed.
saddest things that you see is where people are disqualified from even been given an opportunity without any good reason whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's absurd to me. And I think what you're doing in speaking to the women that have had that experience is really important. You know, I can only speak from the place as a musician and someone who loves music and feels like there are incredible artists that are like Nadia and Clara, et cetera, that are being misrepresented and not being championed enough. But the stories of the women that have actually gone through this are most important, and those are the ones
Yeah.
that need to be heard and reinforced through these types of programs, because then perhaps the entire gravity of the situation could be understood, and then something will hopefully change.
Well, that's what we're aiming for, indeed.
Absolutely. Like one of the greatest things in the entire world is music and the arts.
Yeah.
And when you look at silly and absurd social structures that prevent great music and art from being created, let alone exposed to the world, like that's, in my estimation, that's tremendously tragic. And
Yeah.
we have to do everything possible to change that if we can.
Well,
You
thank
know,
you so much for sharing, Armen. This was very, very interesting, and I hope more people will enjoy our conversation.
thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me and giving me an opportunity to highlight the work of both Clara and Nadia Boulanger. And I certainly hope it's a beginning of more discovery for everyone, myself included.